بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. My respected elders, brothers in Islam, I would like to welcome you to the sixth session of the IPCI Comparative Religion course. And in today's session, it's a much awaited session. We're going to be talking about how to actually go about dialoguing with Christians. And before we start, as usual, I'd just like to mention a verse from the Quran or Hadith. And today, the verse of the Quran, قُلْ هَلْ يَسْتَوِي الَّذِينَ يَعْلَمُونَ وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. That admittedly this is talking about those who recognize Allah and those who do not recognize Allah. But from this we understand that knowledge in itself is power. The person who has knowledge cannot be equated with the person who does not have knowledge. And all of us today have come here in search of knowledge that's valuable, that's going to assist us in our daily life, that's going to assist us in our interactions, that's going to assist us when we attempt to give da'wah to Christians, inshallah. So an overview of today's session, we're going to just start off with looking at an introduction to dialoguing. How do we go about it? What should be our mindset? What methods should we approach? Then we're going to look at certain topics that we can bring about. And today, there's 5 topics in total, but for today I've chosen 3. The first is the reliability of the New Testament, whether the Bible is a reliable source of information or not. The second one is technically a subcategory of this, but it's errors in the Gospels. And we're going to be comparing, so that's why I hope everyone has a Bible in front of them. In some places, we're going to be opening the Bible, reading, looking at certain places, comparing, seeing the contradictions. And the third topic of discussion is following the prophets of the past. So many times a Christian is unaware that the salah we perform is found to some extent amongst the previous prophets, with Jesus himself. Even the purifying ritual before praying is found in the Bible, it's found in the Old Testament, it's found in the New Testament. So this can be a powerful form of dawah. So inshallah, we're going to be marking off in our Bibles, or we're going to just be understanding what's happening, and then later on with the module notes, with the slides that you have in front of you, you can go home and mark it in your Bible at that time. Now, points to note when we're dialoguing. We need to understand that for the past 3 sessions, we've just been learning. We haven't spoken about how to approach a Christian. We haven't spoken about what method to use, what topic to talk about. We've just been learning basics about scripture, about history, about theology. And now we're going to be trying to put that into action. But we need to understand that all of the previous information is extremely important, because sometimes when you quote something but you have no idea what you're talking about, it shows. A person can tell that this person just copied and pasted this from the internet, or he sat in one lecture and he just saw this and now he's coming and telling me, but he doesn't really understand what he's saying. So the previous sessions are extremely important. The next point is that our initial objective is not confrontation, it's dialogue. And I'd say one further than that is that our original objective is to spread the message of Islam. And in order to spread the message of Islam, sometimes if you come across in a confrontational way and you're trying to prove a point, you're trying to show the other person that what you believed your whole life was wrong, it's going to make him more stubborn, it's going to make him more obstinate, and then you're going against your original purpose, because you're not going to accept the message, no matter how many points you prove to him, no matter how many contradictions you show him, because your approach was wrong, because you went there to try and prove a point. Then your original objective is going to be lost, because you're never going to accept what you're saying. The next thing is that we're going to look, in all of these topics, we're going to look at it from a 3-pronged approach. So for example, the Trinity, we're going to look at whether it has scriptural backing. We're going to look at it logically, whether it makes sense. We're going to look at it historically, how it came about historically. And similarly, the other topics as well, we're going to approach it from these 3 angles. And when it comes to a scriptural angle, then it would be best that we memorize the references. So certain references we're giving today, when you go home, it will be helpful that you memorize these, you mark them off in your Bible at home, so you can use this more efficiently. Now, just to understand what we mean when we say logical, scriptural, and historical. So, example, if I want to talk about the Trinity from a logical point of view, I'll make the argument that if there's 3 separate individual entities, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, how can this be monotheism logically? So that's a logical argument I'm making. If I want to make a scriptural argument, I'll say, how can you say that Jesus is equal to God when Jesus says in the Gospel of John, the Father is greater than I? So that's a scriptural argument, because I'm using the scripture. And the previous one was a logical argument. A historical argument will be where I say, Why is the Trinity a necessary part of Christianity, whereas for the first 200-300 years, none of the church fathers believed in it? So that's a historical argument. I'm using history against them. So especially when it comes to the Trinity, we're going to divide it like this. In the other topics of discourse, we may not clearly mention it, but these three angles will be included there as well. And so just to go over again the 5 topics for discourse: the reliability of the Gospels, number 1; errors in the Bible, number 2; Tawheed and Trinity, number 3; how Muslims follow Jesus and the law of God, number 4; and 5, Muhammad in the Bible. Number 1, 2, and 4 we're going to be going over today, and 3 and 5 inshallah will be for next week. So number 1, reliability of the Gospel. So we just need to understand something before we go into this, that generally, most of the time, the Christian that you're talking to is going to believe that the Bible in front of him is the inspired word of God. And on top of that, he's going to believe that it's inerrant. There are no errors in this book, right? And we're going to go about trying to disprove that. So that's what's going to follow in the next few slides. And this is not mentioned in the slides, and I think maybe not even in the module notes. But before this, we need to ask the question, what is the proof that the Bible sitting in front of you is inspired and inerrant? So for example, in the Quran it clearly says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to protect the book. It clearly says that if it was from anyone other than Allah, you would have found mistakes in it, meaning there's no mistakes in it. So there's a reason why we're saying that. But when we're looking at the 27 books in the New Testament, does anyone there say what I'm writing is inspired by God? Do any of the books say there are no mistakes in these books? None of them even say that in the first place. So what is this belief based on? So before we go about trying to disprove it, our first question would rather be, why do you hold this belief in the first place? These were different authors writing in different times. They never knew that their different books are going to be compiled into one book. And now you're saying that none of these books can contradict one another. But none of them said they were writing and they were inspired by God. None of them said that my book will not contradict with the other books that you put in this one book. They didn't have any idea of that. So why did this idea creep in? How did it creep in? That's something we need to know. That's something we need to ask. That we want to ask the Christian, why do you have this belief in the first place? And see what answer he gives. Generally, you will find an answer like they'll quote 1 Timothy, which says the scriptures are inspired by God. But that's like a very vague statement. Does it mean the 27 books in the New Testament? How do we know which scriptures? Did they even say they were writing scriptures? So in fact, this belief doesn't have a proof for it in the first place. So that's number 1. We need to understand that, be clear about that. Now let's go on to the topic at hand. So the reliability of the Gospels is the safest topic to start off with. You see, if I start off with Tawheed and Trinity, then if I put forward an objection, he can put forward another objection against the Quran, against Tawheed, he can this objection, that objection. But if we leave our topic just on the Bible, just on the Gospels, we're talking about the reliability of the Gospels now, then it's a very safe topic for a Muslim to engage in, even if he doesn't have too much of knowledge about Islam to defend him, because he won't need to, because we're talking only about the Gospels now. That's why the first 2 topics I mentioned, these are the ones you should aim to start off with. They're safe topics, you can move with them, you don't need to be an expert in Islam, you don't need to be an alim to use these topics. So this is the safest topic to start with. Also, it makes logical sense that if we're going to discuss the Trinity and Tawheed, etc., you're going to quote verses from this book, I'm going to quote verses from this book, but is it a reliable book to begin with in the first place? So logically as well, this topic needs to come first. We need to talk about the reliability or lack thereof of this book. Now, we are going to look at 4 reasons why the New Testament is not reliable, and you can use this, one after the other when you're discussing with a Christian, 4 different angles. The 4th one is errors in the Bible, which is going to come as the second topic, but let's go through the first 3. So the first reason why we'd say that we can't trust, especially the Gospels, as a source of knowledge about our religion is there's a huge gap between when the original events occurred, when the life of Jesus was, from the year 0 to 33, and when the first authors were writing, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we know that's not their real names, that they were writing from 70 to 100. That's a 40-year gap. Now think about this. I heard a story about something that happened last week. I heard it from my mother, who heard it from her sister, who heard it from someone else. Already 3 people. Imagine if you're writing 40 years later, how many different people that story will have to go through. So we want to know firstly, who are the authors? They are unknown. Who did they hear from? What's the chain of narration of the story that you're telling us? Because we as Muslims, we believe in hadith, which has a stringent conditions for accepting narrations from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have shurut of sihhatu sanad. We need to know the chain of narration. So we're going to, let's apply that now to the Gospels and see whether does it fit the chain of narration to be considered authentic. So according to hadith principles, if you had to grade the Gospels, they'd be extremely da'if jiddan, they'll say, very, very weak. Let's look at it, right? When we're grading a hadith, for it to be authentic, these four conditions need to be met, basically. All the narrators of the chain must have an excellent memory, right? And that already implies that you need to know all of the narrators of the chain. All of the narrators of the chain must be adil, they must be trustworthy. There should be no missing link in the chain. We need to know all of the narrators. And there should be agreement of the different chains, meaning there should be no contradictions. Now contrast this to the Gospels where we have no idea of the chain of narration whatsoever, right? We have no idea who the author is, so he's majhul in the terms of hadith. We don't know the chain of narration. We have no idea whether they're trustworthy, whether they have an excellent memory. And there's errors between all of them, so therefore the chains of narration don't even add up. So in all of these conditions, the Gospels fail. And this is only the condition for hadith. For Quran is mutawatir. It's much, much stronger than that. This is the condition for khabar wahid hadith. Let's just look at an example. And I got these examples in the module notes. This is a hadith from Sahih Muslim. I put one with a bit of a long chain of narrations. We can see there's 5 different people between the author of the book and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But what can we see? For every single one of these narrators, we have a biography. On the left-hand side here, I got the biography of some of the narrators. Abdullah bin Umar, the son of Umar radiallahu anhu. We got a whole biography of him. We got the reports of people about him. We know his memory. We know whether he's adil. All of the narrators, the exact same thing is found. The author of the book, we know exactly, his biography fills up an entire book on its own. If you look at another narration, look at this chain of narration in the Muwatta of Imam Malik. Only 2 narrators between Imam Malik and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Together with this, there are other chains of narration of the same hadith. This hadith is الَّذِي تَفُوتُهُ صَلَاةُ الْعَصْرِ فَكَأَنَّمَا وُتِرَ أَهْلَهُ وَمَالَهُ. That person who misses his Salatul Asr, it's as though he has lost his entire wealth and family. Look at the chain of narration for this hadith. There's just 2 people there, extremely reliable people we know basically about their entire life. Then this hadith now qualifies to be authentic. Together with this, there are other chains of narration. I've only mentioned one here. Now it qualifies to be authentic. Look at another hadith I have here where the Sahaba asked Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam about the sea water, whether you can use it for wudu, whether you can eat the animals in it. So Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam says, al-halalu maytatuhu. This hadith, I've got 6 different chains of narration here, all ending up in different books. In reality, this hadith has over 12 chains of narration, separate chains of narration coming down for this one hadith. And remember, this doesn't even compare to the strength of the Quran when it comes to chain of narration. So I have these 3 hadith here that you can show a person that, look, we have all of their biographies, we know all of the chain of narrators, and then only it passes a certain criteria where we can say, right, this is acceptable to be used as a source for our religion. So that's the key that we're trying to get here. So the conclusion that we're going to come to now is we cannot base our religious beliefs on information with such a low level of certainty like the Gospels. It doesn't meet any of the conditions for hadith. The Gospels are weaker than most of the weak hadith, let alone comparing it to the Quran, when you look at the chain of narration, because there's no chain of narration basically. And if a Christian can accept the Gospels, despite the fact that the chain of narration is weak, despite the fact that we don't know who wrote them, then all the more you should be accepting what's in the Quran and hadith. Just looking at it from an epistemological level, from sources of knowledge, this is much stronger, so you should be accepting this if you're accepting that. So this is our first line of approach for the Christian, that what is the source, what is the chain of narration for these Gospels? How do we know where they got their stories from? How do we know whether they are reliable in what they are reporting, if they are reporting 40 to 70 years later? So that's the first approach you will come to a Christian with, is that can we really trust these 4 authors, whoever they may be, despite the fact that they're writing so late, despite the fact that they are contradicting one another? So that's the first approach, or the first reason. The second reason will be the canonization of the Bible. How did you decide which books made it into the Bible and which books didn't make it into the Bible? So was that process divine? Who decided that? How did they decide it? There were so many other Gospels written, so many other Acts written, so many other letters written. So the process of deciding which books go in and which books don't go in, that process, was it divine? How come in the early church people had different versions? People had only one Gospel. Some of them had 2 Gospels. Some of them had even more Gospels. So this process of deciding which books go in here and which don't, was it a divine process? Who decided it? How do we know that it's correct? So all of these things we need to consider when it comes to canonization, and this is the second question that we will ask the Christian. What is the proof that these books should be here and the other books should not be here. So that's reason number 2. Canonization, pretty simple. It's strong because there's no, remember, the first time these books came together, these separate 27 books came together in one book form was in the year 367, 300 years after Jesus. And even then, all Christians didn't accept it. Even then, some Christians had other books, some Christians didn't have the books that were here. It took a few centuries after that for this set of books to be established as the Bible. So that's our second line of reasoning. So first line of reasoning was the chain of narration of the Gospels. The second line of reasoning is the canonization of the book. Who decided? How did they decide? Was this a divine process? If it wasn't a divine process, it was a human process, then could they not have made mistakes? So that's our second line of reasoning. The third line of reasoning is the scribal errors and insertions. So we discussed now the chain of narration from the author to the original events. What was the chain of narration? We have no idea. But now what about between the original book that the author wrote and the earliest manuscripts we have? So we don't have the original that Mark or Matthew or Luke or John, we don't have the originals. We've got manuscripts coming. The earliest manuscripts are from the 4th century, the earliest complete manuscripts from the 4th century. So in this process of copying, there were so many differences in the manuscripts, so many errors, so many changes. In fact, and this is a fact, there are more differences in these manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament itself. That's how different these manuscripts are. Some of them are small mistakes, others are actually deliberate changes. Some of them don't affect the meaning, some of them do affect the meaning, and we're going to look at some of this now. And so when we're talking about this line of reasoning, we're going to want to show, so the Christian will say, no, it's just small errors. These errors don't affect the meaning. So now we are going to go to our Bibles and we're going to show 3 verses or 3 sets of verses where it was a huge change in the Bible. So remember we said basically the first version of the Bible to be printed from the earliest Greek manuscripts was the Textus Receptus, that Desiderius Erasmus went and he used a very low quality 12th century manuscript. He made his copy of the Bible, and the King James version that I have in front of me, the gold one that some of you might have, that is based on that very weak version. And this became the most popular Bible in the entire Christian world. Up to today, it's still probably the most used Bible. It's the second most bought Bible. Even though people knew it was riddled with errors, it had things that were not supposed to be there, yet it became the most popular Bible for a span of about 500 years. Up to today, it's basically the most popular Bible. And we are going to show 3 examples of where in this Bible there are verses that have now been expunged and removed, and therefore in the blue Bibles, the NIV you see in front of you, these verses are no longer there. And these are not verses that have no real bearing on the meaning. These are important verses. These are verses that Christians used to quote over and over again over the centuries because they felt that it was part of the Bible. And now in the New International Version and other versions where they use the critical text, they don't rely on Erasmus's text. They made a new one with the earliest manuscripts. They have expunged these verses. So we're going to show 3 important insertions, and for these ones, you can open the Bible if you want to read it, the Bible in front of you, but I have the quotation on screen also as well. So I've got it here, the King James Version. So in the King James Version, in 1 John 5:7, so this is, we'll say according to the Christians, a letter that the disciple John wrote to someone, according to them. In this one, for centuries, this was the verse that Christians used to prove the Bible. If you asked a Christian 200 years ago, even 100 years ago, and 500 years before that, show me a verse in the Bible that proves the Trinity, this is the verse he's going to prove. It was an important verse. It was the only verse that really kind of spoke about the Trinity. And it says, for there are 3 that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these 3 are one. So for centuries, this was the verse that was quoted. Now when we go to the NIV, we see that verse is completely removed. That verse is no longer there. And if you have the NIV with the footnotes, unfortunately this one doesn't have the footnotes, you will see that it says there in the footnote, late manuscripts of the Vulgate testify in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these 3 are one, and there are 3 that testify on earth. It says not found in any Greek manuscript before the 4th century, therefore it has been removed in all new editions of the Bible that are based on the best manuscripts. They have removed this verse. So this is a verse of great significance in the sense that it was the only verse that proved the Trinity completely, and now in the newer editions of the Bible it's removed. So if you have to open your blue NIV and look in there, you're not going to find this verse here. This verse is there, but it's not going to be there. But if you open the King James Version, which is still based on the old manuscript, you will find that verse there. So imagine what a huge discrepancy there are now between these two, in the sense that one has a verse proving the Trinity and one doesn't. So there are three insertions like this that I want us to remember, to know the reference for, so that when you're dialoguing with a Christian, you can show him that, see, I'm not making up that there's a lot of differences and these differences are meaningful. Here's the difference. I got a King James version in front of me. I got a New International Version in front of me. You can see it's in this one and they've taken it out of this one. And in the New International Version, they even say it's not found in any of the early Greek manuscripts. Insertion 2 is perhaps even more shocking than insertion 1. So in all of the Gospels, besides Mark, so let's just say Matthew, Luke, and John, after Mary comes and sees Jesus is not there, then she goes away and she tells the disciples. And, a lot of things happen after this. There's a whole ending where Jesus comes back and he appears to the disciples and he talks to them and he stays for 40 days. So this is found in all of the Gospels. But the actual Gospel of Mark, which is our earliest Gospel, doesn't have that ending. So what happened was, scribes later on felt like, whoa, look at the other three Gospels, got this whole thing, Jesus coming back, he's talking with the disciples, he's giving them advice, he stays there for 40 days, he goes up, and Mark is just ending. It's not there in Mark. So they added a whole ending of Mark. So verses 9 to 20 of the last chapter of Mark, if you open the King James Version, it's there. Mark has a whole extra 12 verses. But when you open your New International Version, that entire ending is removed. Now, what's the ending of Mark? The ending of Mark is this. The woman, so they went, they saw that Jesus had risen from the dead. Then it ends like this. Trembling and bewildered, the woman went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Full stop, it ends. So Mark's gospel ends where the woman see that Jesus had risen and then they don't tell anyone anything, which is a complete contradiction with the other Gospels, which talks about them going to the disciples and telling them, etc., etc., etc. So so what the scribes did is they basically invented an ending for Mark that sort of fitted with the other Gospels. And for centuries, people thought this was how Mark ended. Until now, the newer editions came out, went to the earliest manuscripts, saw that, hey, this ending is not here in the earliest manuscripts. That's why if you read the footnote they have here, it says some manuscripts have the following ending between verses 8 and 9. Then they quickly, the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 to 20. So verses 9 to 20 completely expunged, removed from the King James Version because it was a fabrication. And now the question is going to come to your head, okay, fine. The scholars, they went back to the earliest manuscripts, which are only in the 4th century, and they discovered that it's not there, so they expunged these. But how many more are there like this? That's the question we want to ask. What if we had the original manuscripts? How many more differences would we not have seen? So they're only going to the earliest ones they have because the others are lost. But if we went to the real originals, if we had them, we can only imagine how many more differences would have been found. So these are two very shocking insertions. An entire ending to the Gospel of Mark is inserted, and a verse sort of proving the Trinity is inserted. But in your NIV, in your newer Bibles that are based on the critical text, these verses have been completely removed. So it's just good to mark these verses off. These are the verses you'd want to approach a Christian with when you are dialoguing with him. Just, again, to prove your point that the manuscripts have many differences and we can't really truly get back to the originals. So we're going to talk about that just now. The third insertion, which I want to talk about, and that's going to end the section, is the story of the prostitute. So it's a very famous story also amongst Christians, where Jesus told the people that let he who is without sin cast the first stone. They wanted to punish this prostitute, and they asked Jesus, what must we do? Should we punish her? Should we not punish her? So Jesus gave it's like a nice answer which keeps them quiet, and he satisfies both parties. It's a very famous story amongst Christians. But again, if you look in the NIV, they have removed this entire story and they have said that this is also an addition, it's an insertion. So this entire story of the prostitute, which comes in the Gospel of John, it's a big story, it's a famous story, but in the newer versions of the Bible that are based on the critical text, they have removed this entire story as well. So for us, these are three examples that we can use to show that the differences amongst the manuscripts results in huge differences in the Bibles. And these are three examples that we must keep. There's many more examples also, but I think these are ones that are shocking. They're big differences, entire verses, the entire ending of Mark, the entire story of the prostitute. And it's not us who's saying that these are fabrications. It's the Christians themselves. In the NIV, when you open it, they themselves will tell you these verses were forgeries, they were pushed inside by scribes, and now we have removed them. So these three verses, that's the 1 John 5:7, the ending of Mark, and the story of the prostitute. then you're ready already to be able to show the Christian that, see, we can't really rely on this as a piece of evidence. So we basically showed three ways now on why we can't rely on the Gospels. The first is the chain of narration between the authors and the original events. The second is canonization, who decided. The third is the fact that the manuscripts we're using are so different we can't tell which is the original. And this is the last point I want to make on this topic, that even if the original Gospels were inspired, even if the original Gospels were written and God inspired them and they wrote it, we don't have the originals. We got all of these copies of copies of copies, all of them are different. We can't tell which is the original. These copies and this copy and that copy, they're not inspired. So how do we tell which is the original inspired? So it doesn't even matter that the original was inspired, because the copies we have today are definitely not inspired, because as you can see, they're contradicting one another left, right, and center. So that's finished with that section. Now we're going to go to errors in the Bible. This is also a reason why we don't trust the New Testament. And here, so for some of the stories, we're going to, it's not going to be practical for us to read all of these stories from the Bible. It's going to take up too much of time. But maybe I've got about 8 errors or 8 contradictions and 1 false prophecy. For 2 or 3 of them, we'll read them directly from the Bible. And the rest, I just got the quote on the slides, and we'll work like that. And from these 8 or 9 that I have here, I want you to select about 3 that you're going to learn, you're going to memorize, you're going to know. And I'll show you which ones are easier to use, which ones are more difficult to use, so you can mark these off later on. So before we start this, it's important to understand what's a contradiction. So let's just take an example. Let's say, someone came, one version of a story told me that Ibrahim went to the bathroom, he brushed his teeth, then he went to the toilet and he came out, right? Another version of the story told me Ibrahim went to the toilet, he brushed his teeth and he came out. Is there a contradiction really? One said he brushed his teeth and went to the toilet. The other one only said he brushed his teeth. That's not really a contradiction. There's just a difference between the 2 stories. So many times we have to be careful when we're selecting a contradiction. We might tell the Christian, see, there's a contradiction between these 2. He'll say, no, the one just reported extra information and the one reported less information. It's not a contradiction. And we need to understand that people can make interpretations to interpret anything away. Let me give you another example along the same lines. So let's say one person said, Ibrahim went to the bathroom. He brushed his teeth, then he went to the toilet. He told us that. Person number 2 told us, Ibrahim went to the bathroom, he went to the toilet, then he brushed his teeth. Now, is that a contradiction? That seems like a contradiction. But a Christian can, I'm just saying, or any person can still reconcile it. He can say, no, you know what really happened? Ibrahim went to the bathroom, he brushed his teeth, he went to the toilet, then he brushed his teeth again. So both people are right in what they said. So we need to understand this, that people have the ability to reconcile any 2 stories. Unless I said, no, he went at this time to the toilet, and then maybe we can say there's a contradiction, which is not going to happen. So all of these contradictions that we're going to bring, they might seem like so clear to us. But a Christian will say, no, perhaps it happened like this, maybe this really happened, and they'll just, they'll make a new story where it seems like both fit. Therefore, it's important to have about 3 or 4 lined up. So, okay, you can interpret one, then you interpret another one, but after the 3rd or 4th one, you're coming to think that, maybe they just made a mistake. Maybe that's the simplest thing. So we need to ask, okay, fine, it's possible that your explanation happened, but which is more likely, which makes the most sense? We need to go down that line. Because remember, all of these contradictions, I promise you all of them, they have some sort of interpretation for them. And in the module notes, I've included their responses, so you can see how they go about this. But we won't have time to do that. When it comes to the Old Testament, because we've got a different section on Judaism, I'm not going to go too much into this. In the module notes, there are some contradictions there, but because in the topic of Judaism, we'll go into the Old Testament and see the contradictions there, I'm going to focus mostly on the New Testament and basically mostly on the Gospels themselves for the contradictions here. So this is just a picture from the module notes. There's about 71 contradictions they have here from the Old Testament. If anyone wants, the resources are there in the module notes. You can take them, you can write them down, you can use them. But we're going to focus now on contradictions in the New Testament. So the first one comes right at the beginning. So in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, both these authors want to give the genealogy of Jesus. They want to give the lineage of Jesus. Why do they want to do this? Now remember, the Gospel authors are writing to a specific audience. They're trying to prove to their audience that Jesus is the Messiah. And the Messiah has to be from the line of David. He has to be one of the grandchildren of David. Therefore, the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke both begin with genealogies of Jesus, trying to show that he's a grandchild of David. That's their purpose in doing this. So, but again, we can see that they probably both didn't know each other because there's contradictions in this. So this is one that I think everyone should know, the genealogies. It comes right at the beginning of Matthew, and it comes in Luke chapter 3, verses 23 to 38, the genealogy of Jesus. Now, there are 4 issues with this genealogy. So Matthew's one goes to Abraham, Luke's one goes right to Adam alayhi salam, right? But that's not an issue. The first problem and direct contradiction we'll see is that it says that Jesus' father is Joseph. Now remember, Jesus didn't really have a father, and we know, and they also know, but they have Joseph. Now, who is Joseph's father? According to the Gospel of Matthew, it's Jacob. According to the Gospel of Luke, it's Heli. So you just have these 2 genealogies in front of you. See, in the Gospel of Matthew, Joseph's father is Jacob. In the Gospel of Luke, his father is Heli. It's a clear contradiction. But now I'll just give you an idea into how they try and make that wheel of it. They say, no, this is his lineage from his mother's side, this is his lineage from his father's side. But that can't work because it says the father of Joseph in both. So you're talking about his father. The one says it's Heli, the one says it's Jacob. Now this one, there's many more issues with this lineage we're going to show. So the first issue is, who is the father of Joseph? So we have these 2 lineages in front of us. Ask the question, who is the father of Joseph? The Gospel of Matthew is saying one thing, the Gospel of Luke is saying something completely different. The second issue we have with this is that, in the Old Testament, there's a lot of lineages also. So they talk about the grandsons of David. When we compare the Old Testament in 1 Chronicles and we see the lineage given there, and all this is in the module notes, we see that Matthew's lineage doesn't correspond with the Old Testament lineage. So Matthew leaves out 3 people there, he leaves out another person there, and when people looked into who these people he left out were, they found that these were wicked kings. So Matthew didn't want to have them in Jesus' lineage, so he took them out. So there's a contradiction between the lineage in Matthew and the lineage in the Old Testament as well. So just remember this. That's our second problem. So I just put the lineages of Matthew and Luke. Our first problem is, who's the father of Joseph? Is it Jacob or is it Heli? The second problem is, it's contradicting the New Testament, the lineage that's given as in the Old Testament. It's contradicting that. And just one more point of information, because we don't have the text in front of us. Matthew makes a claim that there are 42 people between Jesus, or counting Jesus, and between Abraham. He says there's 14, 14, 14. So like in today's time, 40 is like a special number. So at that time, 14 was like a very significant number. So Matthew's trying to show that there were 14 people between Jesus and the exile, 14 people between the exile and David, 14, like he's showing 14, 14, 14, which equals to 42. But when we count the number of people in the lineage, it's 41. It's not even 42. So that's the third problem that we have with this lineage, right? The fourth problem we have is, if you have to count the people from Jesus to David in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, there's a huge difference. It's almost double the number of people in between the two. How is it possible to have so many? And we know it's 2 different lineages because it's a mistake, but how does that even tie up? So that's the fourth problem. And the fifth problem is, Jesus doesn't even have a father. So how are you showing his lineage through Joseph? He doesn't even have a father in the first place. But again, I gave 5 problems with his lineage. The first 3 are the most important. So when you have these 2 passages and you're talking to a Christian, your first question is, who's the father of Joseph? Is it Jacob or Heli? Your second one is, why is it contradicting the Old Testament? And I got the reference there in 1 Chronicles chapter 3. Your second question is, Matthew claims there's 42 generations. Why are there only 41? So those are our 3 main issues that we have with these 2 lineages. So that's our New Testament contradiction number 1, and this is one that I think everyone should mark off. We're going to go through 8 or 9. You don't have to know all of these 8 or 9, but 3 or 4 you should choose at least. And I think this is definitely one of them, because there's so many issues with these 2 lineages. Yeah, there's a lot of issues. Contradiction number 2. This one I don't want anyone to, because it's got to do with basically a whole chapter or 2 chapters. You can just listen for this one, understand this one, and maybe you can learn it later on. So remember again, Matthew and Luke are trying to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. Now the Messiah is supposed to be born in Bethlehem, right? And everyone knows this, everyone understands this. He has to be from the lineage of David. He has to be born in Bethlehem. But the thing is, Jesus, all of his stories say he grew up in Nazareth, he preached in Nazareth. So these authors needed to try and find a way to make Jesus come to Bethlehem to be born and then grow up in Nazareth. Now, both of these authors came up with different solutions. So if we read the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew here, he says that Jesus is born in Bethlehem. So he wasn't born in Nazareth, he's born in Bethlehem. And then the king wants to kill him, so he flees to Egypt. And then he comes back, and then there's another king there who still wants to kill him, so he has to go and flee to Nazareth. So that was Matthew's solution. Matthew said, no, he's from Bethlehem, but then he fled to Egypt. When he was coming back to Bethlehem, a new king was there who was still bad, so he had to go to Nazareth, right? Luke's gospel, Luke has a different scenario. Luke says, no, he's born in Nazareth, but then he had to come down to Bethlehem for a census because the Roman Empire was having a census. So he came to Bethlehem, he was born there, Joseph and Mary came to Bethlehem, Jesus was born there, and then he went back to Nazareth. There's no talk of going to Egypt, there's no talk about a king who wants to kill him and he has to escape to Egypt. Two completely different stories. Very, very different. There's like no way of reconciling. And there's other issues with this also. So basically, Luke says that, you know what, Joseph and Mary have to come to Bethlehem because everyone needs to relocate to where his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather lived. The whole Roman Empire, this is what he's claiming, that in the entire Roman Empire, everyone needs to relocate to where his great-great-great-grandfather lived. It's impossible. It never happened from historical records. He only said that happened. Why? So he could make Joseph and Mary come down to Bethlehem. Jesus is born in Bethlehem now, and then he can go back. So it's a complete fabrication historically, and there's good historical records from that time. There was no such census that ever occurred. But again, this is just one to remember. Later on, you can go through it. Because it goes through about 2 chapters, I don't want you to mark that down and have something that you're going to use, because it takes a lot of explaining. Like this, I simplified it, but it's a story that goes through 1 or 2 chapters completely. So contradiction number 3. So this is one where I'll say we all open our Bibles. Let's read these true stories together. Let's see if we can find a contradiction, right? The rest of them, inshallah, they'll be on the screen. But for this one, just so we get some exposure to opening the Bible here. So let's open the Gospel of Mark first, chapter number 5, verse number 21. So the Gospel of Mark will be the second Gospel in the New Testament. So remember, Old Testament, New Testament. Go to the New Testament, the Gospel of Mark, chapter number 5, verse 21 to 43. So this is a story where a person comes to Jesus and his daughter is sick and he wants Jesus to heal his daughter. But there's a contradiction in the story and we're going to look at that just now. So if you have the King James Version, it's on page 576. So I don't know if you guys found it. So the Gospel of Mark, chapter number 5, we'll start reading from verse 22. And now my King James Version has heavy English, so you just have to listen to it. And behold, there cometh one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus. So Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, and he said, my little daughter is at the point of death. She's almost dying. So come and heal her. I'm just putting it in my own words. And Jesus went with him, and people followed him and thronged around him. So he was going to heal this person's daughter, who was very sick. And whilst he was doing this now, a certain woman came, and she had a problem. So Jesus went, and he cured that woman, right? So that story takes up a bit of the story here, right? So as I'm just going to carry on reading here. And he said unto her, daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace and be whole of thy plague. Then, if you look at verse 35, we see that whilst he was curing this other woman, they came from the ruler of the synagogue's house. So that same man who said, come heal my daughter who's very sick, someone came from there and said, your daughter has died now. So why even trouble Jesus? Your daughter's already dead. So understand the story. First, this leader came to Jesus and said, my daughter's very sick, come heal her. Now on the way to heal her, Jesus got distracted by healing someone else, and someone came from that person's house and said, your daughter's dead, just leave this person, she's already dead. But now Jesus goes to the house and he raises her up from the dead. So we know Quran tells us that Isa alayhi salam raised people up from the dead. So this is the version in Mark. He comes there, says, my daughter's sick. On the way, Jesus gets distracted, his daughter dies, and Jesus said, no, I can still bring her back to life. Jesus brings her back to life. Let's go to the Gospel of Matthew now and see if the story adds up there. So the Gospel of Matthew will just be the Gospel before that, chapter number 9, verse number 18. So if we look at this chapter, in this Gospel now, what happens is, when he spake these things, talking about Jesus, there In the King James Version, it'll be page 556. So in this story now, there came a certain ruler and worshipped him, saying, "My daughter is even now dead, but come and lay thy hand upon her, and she shall live." So in this story, Jairus, this leader, he doesn't come to Jesus to say, "My daughter's sick, come cure." He comes straight and says, "My daughter's dead, come bring her back to life." So you can see the contradiction in the true stories. So we're just reading this one. I wouldn't recommend this one also for you to mark off, but just for us to get a hang of opening the Bible, seeing the stories. As you can see, the King James Version, the English is quite difficult. It's written in Old English, very classical English. So you can see that the difference, basically we'll ask the Christian, was the girl dead when the father came, or did she die after? In the Gospel of Mark, when the father came, she was alive but very sick. In the Gospel of Matthew, when her father comes, she's already dead. He comes to ask Jesus, "Can you please bring my daughter back to life?" So two different stories, talking about the same person, but the slight differences in the story. And one more that I want us to open here, and this is one we need to mark off, is the death of Judas. So let me just give you an introduction to this. So when the authorities were looking to crucify Jesus and lock him up, one of his disciples called Judas betrayed Jesus and brought the authorities to him to arrest him, right? And the story is narrated in the Gospel of Matthew and in the book of Acts. And both these stories, they describe how Judas basically died or committed suicide, and they describe the place he committed suicide in. So let's read both these stories in the relevant chapters. Again, I'll give you all some time to open because maybe... So Matthew, let's read it in Matthew's Gospel first. So the Gospel of Matthew, chapter number 27. So let's open there. This is one of those ones that you'd want to mark off because there's a very clear discrepancy between the way the true stories are narrated. So if everyone has Gospel of Matthew, chapter number 27 open, that's on page 571 in the King James Version. So I'm just going to read this one, I'm going to read it. So we'll start from verse 3. So it says, "Then Judas, which had betrayed him, when he saw that he was condemned, repented himself." So in order for Judas to betray Jesus, the rulers gave him 30 pieces of silver. So that's something you need to know also. So he saw what happened to Jesus. He repented himself, Judas. He brought the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, "I have sinned in that I have betrayed innocent blood." So now Judas is feeling bad. He betrayed Jesus. And they said, "What is that to us? See thou to that." So he came to the leaders of the temple there, and he said, I'm feeling bad that I betrayed Jesus. So take back these 30 pieces of silver. I don't want it. So they said, we don't want to have anything to do with you. So it says here, he cast down the pieces of silver in the temple. So he took the pieces of silver they gave him, he put it in the temple, he departed, he went and he hanged himself. So remember, according to the Gospel of Matthew, Judas felt bad. The bribe money they had given him, he tried to give it back, they didn't take it. So he left it in the temple, he went and he hanged himself. That's in the Gospel of Matthew, right? And the chiefs saw this money there. They took the money and they said, "What do we do with this here? It's not lawful for us to use it because it's for the price of blood," they said. And they used that money and they bought a potter's field to bury this. So they bought a land and they made it a graveyard and they called it the field of blood. So let's just go through the story again. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Judas is feeling bad. He wants to give back the money that they gave him. They don't want to take it. He leaves it in the temple. He goes and he hangs himself. The people of the temple see the money there. They say, "What can we do with this money? It's not lawful for us to use." They purchase a land and they make it a graveyard, and it's called the field of blood. Right? So that's what happened in the Gospel of Matthew. Now open Acts, which will be the 5th book of the New Testament, the book of Acts. Remember, the book of Acts is a book which tells you the stories of the disciples after Jesus. So chapter 1, verse 18. Right, so if you're in the King James Version, it's page 629, 628, 629. And now this book of Acts is going to tell us how Judas died as well. It's going to tell us a similar story, but you're going to see it's quite different. So here they're talking about Judas. If we start from verse 17, it says, "For he was numbered with us and had obtained part of this ministry." So meaning he was also a disciple. Now this man, referring to Judas, he purchased a field with the 30 pieces of silver. And after he purchased the field, falling headlong, he burst asunder and all his bowels gushed out. And it was known unto all the dwellers at Jerusalem, insomuch as that field is called in their proper tongue Akeldelma, that is to say, the field of blood. So in this story, it's completely different. In this one, Judas himself takes the 30 pieces of silver. He goes and he purchases a land for himself. While he's walking there one day, he falls, he hits his head, his stomach comes out, he dies over there. And because he died in the land, the people called it the field of blood. So it's very different stories, very, very different stories. So in these two different stories, we'd want to ask, number one, who buys this field? In the Gospel of Matthew, the people at the temple, they went and bought the field because Judas left the money there. In the book of Acts, Judas himself went and bought the field. So there's the contradiction there. How does Judas die? In the Gospel of Matthew, he hangs himself. In the book of Acts, he falls headlong and his intestines come out and all sorts of things happen to him. Number three, why does he die? The Gospel of Matthew says that it's suicide. The book of Acts says it's an accident. He falls and trips over. Number four, why is the field called the field of blood? In the Gospel of Matthew, it's called the field of blood because they used blood money, the temple elders, and they bought a land and they made it a graveyard with blood money, so it's called the field of blood. In the book of Acts, because Judas fell and he died and his blood went splattering everywhere, they call it the field of blood. So completely different in all aspects. Therefore, I'd say this is one that you should also, what the genealogies in the first one, and this one, this should be one that you mark off. Right, from now on, these are small, easy ones. We don't have to read, or everything is on the screen, and these you can choose now. It's up to you which ones you want to mark off, which ones you don't want. So at the end, according to the Gospels, Jesus, when he's on the cross, and he cries out just before or after he's crucified, and the curtain of the temple tears. Now, the curtain of the temple in Judaism was like a very significant thing. This curtain was like a veil, and if you entered through that veil, then it was believed that that's where the presence of God resided. So no one was allowed to go there. So the Gospel authors are saying that when Jesus died, this this curtain tore, so it's significant of now God is reuniting with mankind or whatever, right? But that's not our issue. Our issue here is that according to the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus had cried out in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Now, according to the Gospel of Luke, the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I command my spirit." So this is an easy one also. The first one says that Jesus died, and then the curtain was torn. The other one says the curtain was torn, and then Jesus died. So it's a simple, easy contradiction. You can choose if you want to mark this off or not. Contradiction number 6, a staff. So remember the Gospels are telling this, they're trying to tell the biography of Jesus. They mostly have the same stories in them. So we're going to look at these same stories and see the discrepancies between them. So in Mark, he gives his disciples instructions. He says, take nothing for the journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in your belts. If you look at Luke, he says, take nothing, not even a staff. So in the first one, he's saying, take nothing, but you can take a staff with you. The second one, it's the same story that they're talking about. He's saying, you're not even allowed to take a staff. So that's another easy contradiction. Doesn't need much explanation. If you want to mark it off, you can mark it off. It's quite a clear contradiction here. And for us, there's logical explanations for these things. For example, the Gospel of Luke emphasizes certain things that the Gospel of Mark doesn't. The Gospel of Luke perhaps emphasizes how Jesus told his disciples to live away from the world completely. So not even a staff you can take, So he'll make certain changes. And Luke copied from Mark, as we showed in earlier things. So if he felt that a certain thing wasn't wrong, he could just change it. So perhaps this was a scribal error, or perhaps he was trying to give off a message. We won't know. Now this contradiction number 7 is another very easy one. So remember we showed that the Gospel of Mark, the entire ending from verse 9 to 20 is a forgery, it's a fabrication. It has been taken out in the New International Version, right? So the Gospel of Mark now says that when the woman saw Jesus, they were scared, they were afraid, and they said nothing to anyone, according to the Gospel of Mark, how it really ends. When you look at the Gospel of Luke, it says when they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11, because there were 12 disciples, but now Judas is gone. So they told all these things to 11 and all the others. So the Gospel of Luke is telling you that the woman came back and they told everyone what happened. And the Gospel of Mark is saying they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So it's another clear contradiction. But again, I'm just going to tell you this in advance. The Christian can reconcile this. He can say, no, they said nothing to anyone initially, but after that they told me. I'm saying, there's always a way, technically, to make it work somehow. It's never a way where they're not going to be able to think of something. That's why I say it's important that you have 3 or 4 or 5. So fine, okay, maybe this one right. But now what about this one? What about the next one, So it's important to have a few lined up. This is an interesting contradiction. Who is Elijah? So in Matthew, Jesus basically tells the people, and if you are willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. So the Jews believe that Elijah was taken up to heaven and he was going to come back. And after he comes back, then only the Messiah was to come after Elijah. So in Matthew, Jesus tells them that, you know what, this Elijah who was to come before me is John the Baptist, and he already came, you saw him, he was Elijah, right? Now, when you go to the Gospel of John, they asked John himself. So in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says John the Baptist is Elijah. When you go to the Gospel of John, they ask John the Baptist, "Are you Elijah?" He says, "No, I'm not." I don't know what's the general answer they give to this. That in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is saying John the Baptist is Elijah, and in the Gospel of John, when they ask John the Baptist, "Are you Elijah?" "No, I'm not." So okay, actually, I remember now the answer they give to this is Jesus is saying no, he is like the symbolic Elijah, that's who he is. And John the Baptist is saying, no, I'm not the real Elijah, I'm the symbolic Elijah. So I'm just saying, again, they can make some interpretation, but it's a clear contradiction. Jesus is saying he is Elijah, he himself is saying, I'm not Elijah. So this is one you should, it's an interesting one, I think perhaps you should mark this one down. And lastly, a false prediction. So, especially in the Gospel of Mark, you see this, but I've got two quotes from Matthew here, where Jesus believes that, you know what, his second coming is going to come like right now. So he's talking about the second coming, and he's going to come and he's going to judge people. And he says, truly I tell you, this generation who he's talking to will not pass away until all these things have happened. And if you just read the verses before, it's talking about his second coming. And if you read Matthew chapter 16, verse 28, it's even clearer. He says, truly I tell you, those who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So according to what this means is, the writer of Matthew felt that Jesus' coming was imminent. But as we can see, much over 1,000 years later, it never really materialized. So this is a false prediction that you can put there. And this prediction it's in most of the Gospels besides John. I think it's in all other three. I just provided these quotes. But it's a constant theme that even Paul himself felt that Jesus was about to come. So he would tell his followers, sell all your things, don't worry, Jesus is coming right now. But it never ever really materialized. And just interestingly, we're going to stop now for the break. This is one of the reasons why they say the Gospel of John was written much later. Because in the Gospel of John now, he has given up this idea of Jesus coming back. So now he says, no, there's no Jesus' second coming. It's going to be in heaven when you die. That's when Jesus' kingdom will be. Why? Because he's writing much later now. He's writing after the year 100. He's seen, no second coming came. All those people in the generation died. It can't be true. Therefore, what he does, he says that no, it's not a second coming. Jesus' kingdom will be in heaven after you die. So just an interesting note as to why the Gospel of John is said to be the latest Gospel. This is one of the reasons. I think we just need a recap of where we are sitting in this entire session. So we said from the outset that I've basically selected 5 topics which you should want to discuss with Christians about. The first was the reliability of the Gospels, and we spoke about a few different angles you can approach it from. Number 1, the Gospels, the authors are unknown. We don't know the chain of narration. Number 2, who decided which Gospels made it into the book, which didn't make it into the book. Number 3, which manuscripts do we use when the manuscripts have so many differences? And there we showed 3 major differences between the King James Version and the New International Version, and basically between any of the new versions and the King James Version. And the King James Version was perhaps the most popular Bible, as we said, for centuries. And this is what Christians read for centuries. And then we went on to a second topic of discussion, which were errors in the Bible. We went through about 8 errors and 1 false prediction. And I feel that after the session is finished, I've sent out a PDF of the module notes. You can go through it, you can have all the references, and choose maybe 3 or 4 of those references to use, because as I said, just one won't be sufficient, because there's always an interpretation that can come. So those were the first 2 topics of discussion. And the third one that we are going to now is a dialogue topic that I want to call Muslims are the followers of the prophets. So this topic is important to know because, number 1, if you're doing a masjid tour, it helps you a lot. You can show the Christians, taking off your shoes, making wudu, praying salah, all of these things. The previous prophets used to do it according to you as well. So it's good, if you're doing a masjid tour. It's also good just to show that, the religion that you are following now is so far off from what Jesus and even the disciples and the prophets used to do. Ours is much closer. Of course, the Christians have a response to this, and that's why this session is going to consists of two parts. In the first one, I'm just going to provide us with references for wudu, salah, taking off your shoes, abstaining from zina, abstaining from alcohol, all of those things that Muslims strictly adhere to, that are found in the Bible. And then the part two is going to look at their response. Their response is going to be the law is cancelled, Jesus abrogated the law, Paul showed us this, so we no longer need to follow the law. And so in the second part, we'll go in depth to show why Paul can't be trusted, why Jesus followed the law, his disciples followed the law. It was only Paul who felt that people were no longer under the law. And we'll give some examples of Paul misquoting the Old Testament and certain some of the things that he did there. So there's always two sections to this dialogue topic. The first is to show these things in the Bible, and the second is to show Christians that you should still be following these things. There is no such thing as the law is abrogated. So inshallah, it's a bit of a short section. There's many more in the module notes, many more things as well. We're not going to go through each reference. When you want, you can take some time and mark it off in your Bible, all of these references. So the first thing we can start off is the greeting, that Assalamu alaikum, salam, sending salams. This is the way that the previous prophets greeted in the Old Testament, where they said in Hebrew, shalom. And Jesus was speaking Aramaic. When we see that whenever he entered a group of people, he would say, peace be unto you. Even when we entered the house, he said you should make, and we know in Islam, when you enter a house, even if no one's there, you should say Assalamu alaikum. And we see here that in Luke, whenever you enter a house, first say, peace be to this house. So it's a very, like a similarity between what Jesus was doing there and what we as Muslims practice. So we're not going to read all of the references, we're not going to go through it. Inshallah, this is going to be a short session, just looking at some of these things. But the point I want to get across is, mark at least one of these off in your Bible later with the module notes. It'll help you when you're doing a masjid tour. It'll help you also to show the Christian that Islam is, many times their perception of Islam is some Arabian thing that came and they don't know how it links up. So this shows them the link between Islam and what we're doing and the succession of the prophets and what they practiced. So in the module notes, I've got quotes from the Old Testament as well, where they greet with shalom, and here we see Jesus doing the same thing. Then before prayer, purifying before prayer. So in the book of Exodus, we see that Moses and Aaron, Musa alayhi salam, Harun alayhi salam here, and his sons, they used to wash their hands and feet before they went into this place where the Lord was, before they did their prayers. And you'll see the same thing for David. And you'll even see Paul doing that when the disciples told him that he needs to show everyone he's still following the law, and he basically was a bit hypocritical in front of everyone. He too had to do a purification in front of everyone. So purifying before you pray or before you enter the temple and things like that was something that was found from the time of probably before Musa and Harun alayhi salam, but we have it from them, and we have going down right till the time of Paul. Then removing your shoes at a sacred place. So we know that when Moses went to speak to God, then God told him, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy. And when we go to the masjid also, before we enter the masjid, we generally take off our shoes and then we enter the masjid. Making sujood in prayer. This is a very, very effective one, where you see that Ibrahim alayhi salam, Musa, Harun, Joshua, the disciples, Jesus himself, all of them, when they prayed, they fell face down. Now how can you pray falling face down except in sajda? Is there any way of praying falling face down besides in sajda? And all of the prophets, from the beginning, you can see right to Jesus, all of them prayed like this. Today, who prays like this? Is the Christians, is the Muslims pray like this? So it's a very powerful example. You can ask the Christian that you see how Jesus is praying here in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's falling on his face. Why you don't do that what he's doing? And what they'll do, they'll go into sajda just how we pray also. So the references here, again, I'm not going to go through all of them. It'll take some time. But there's references here for all of these things. And this is, it's a very, while the argument itself might not be so strong, it resonates with people a lot when they see this, and then they see this is how you pray, and it just like strikes a chord with them. So it's important to have these references, or even just to know this information. In the module notes, I have other things as well, like fasting, etc., because it also speaks about fasting in the New Testament and the Old Testament. But here I just included a few. So refraining from pork, we can see in the Old Testament, it says that the pig is also unclean, refrain from it. And nowadays, there's no such prohibition amongst the Christians. They freely eat pork. For reasons, they have their reasons as well, but we're showing that this was the law of the prophets. Refraining from interest. such a harmful thing for the society, interest. Islam is still strict upon interest. Even Jews to an extent feel that they can take interest from non-Jews and this and that and whatever. Christians feel the same. But it's such a harmful thing. If we didn't have religion there to guide us, if we didn't have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to explain to us how harmful interest is, we would think, what's the big deal? I'm lending you 100 and give me 200 and later. What's the big deal? But the repercussions it has on society and how it makes the rich richer and the poor poorer, because you're making money out of simply having money. Without doing work, you're earning money based on the fact that you have money. So it's a very detrimental thing for society and for equality in society. Again, the Muslims are the ones that are extremely strict when it comes to interest. And this is in accordance with the teachings of the Bible. Then modesty and abstaining from fornication. You can see in the Old Testament, you shall not commit adultery. Even Jesus himself, Jesus takes it one step further. He says, you shall not commit adultery, but I tell you that anyone who even looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And how this is what the Quran says, that you should lower your gaze. يَغْضُضْنَ, lower your gaze. That, one type of fornication can also be committed with the eyes. A similar message is being passed on. So all of these teachings of Jesus, where do we see them exemplified? Do we see them exemplified with the Jews or the Christians, or do we see them exemplified amongst the Muslims? That's what we see. And you see, in the book of Genesis here, Isaac's wife Rebecca, she took a veil and she covered her face. So the wives of the Prophet at that time were also wearing a face veil. There's other examples of that too. You look at Paul, he says that every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered, now he's talking about a head cover, she has dishonored herself. So throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, there is this thing about modesty, whether it's for man also and a woman, that, covering your head, covering your face, all of these things were things that were people looked up to as being something good. And now, because you've removed the law from your life, now you make up your own law. Now once you say God's law doesn't matter, it's abrogated, now people can make up their own law. They can dress however they want, they can do whatever they want, and it leads to what you're seeing now in society. So this is a repercussion we'll talk about, that the law of God is not something that's, and we'll talk about how Paul views it, just to make you sinful. It's there to guide you in your life. Without it, your life can, it's going to be you making the decisions, and it's very easy for human reason to go wrong. So, this is just a snippet of some of the verses we'll show to a Christian: wudu, salah, fasting, all of these things that are in our lives. And the general response that they'll give is they'll try to say that these laws don't matter anymore. These were just like rules and regulations. What's important is we need to love Jesus, we need to love God with our heart. And we say that's very important. But the law is also important at the same time. Now, before we examine the evidence of whether you need to follow the laws or not, we need to think about this and ask the question, does it make sense for the laws of God to be obsolete? Does it make sense that God sends you an entire Sharia that will govern the way you live, that will govern the way you get married, that will govern what you eat, how you dress, govern everything in your life? And you begin to look at these as a burden. You begin to look at it as like, you're doing a party trick, make a dog jump through a hoop, just for that. It's not for that. The law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's not just to test you. It's to make your life better. It's to tell you, stay away from alcohol, stay away from dirty things. It has a purpose and a wisdom behind it. So the Christian doesn't realize this, but in him saying that the law is just a burden, it's a great insult to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How can you treat his law like that? That you think it's just a test. I'm just testing you now to see what you do. No, there's also benefit and wisdoms in it. So there's a great insult in viewing the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as simply a test. It's much, much more than that. So as I say here, was it only to test us and not for our benefit? Of course, these laws were beneficial that came. So the idea of the law being abrogated comes solely from Paul. There's no one, early on, it's very hard to track it to anyone else. Yes, other people believe that Jesus died for your sins, but they still felt you had to follow the law. Not following the law is directly from Paul. And this is something we need to look at now. So look at the understanding of Jesus, right? And there's 3 passages here that we need to quote. I'm just going to read them out, and you can take down the references later. He says, now remember, Paul is saying the law is abolished. You don't need to follow the law. Jesus died for your sins. The law is finished. You just need to love God. These are the words of Jesus in Matthew. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, meaning until the end of time, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commandments and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commandments will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Look at the message of Jesus. If anyone decides to say, no, these commandments don't matter, set aside these commandments, he'll be least in the kingdom of heaven. That's exactly what Paul was doing. Look at another incident in Matthew. A man comes up to Jesus and says, what good thing must I do to get eternal life? Jesus' basic reply was, there's only one who is good. If you want to enter life, eternal life, keep the commandments. That's the message Jesus was portraying his entire life. If you want to get into heaven, if you want, keep the commandments. We don't find anything else from Jesus. And we find that Jesus even made the commandments in certain instances. We saw like with zina, he said even looking at someone is counted as adultery. Here he makes it even stricter. He says, you have heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. So God is saying, yes, Jesus is saying, yes, the law is saying, you know what, don't murder. I'm saying don't even get angry with your brother or sister. He's teaching you good manners. He's teaching you that you have to follow the law. Constant throughout the life of Jesus. Now, an objection Christians will make, but the Pharisees refers to a group of Jews who were living at the time of Jesus, and they used to follow the law. Jesus carried on criticizing them because they only followed the law and they didn't love God. Therefore, we mustn't be like them. We mustn't follow the law and must only love God. But look at what Jesus himself says. Jesus says that when he's addressing the Pharisees, in the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. So Jesus was criticizing them because in public they would follow the law, but in private they wouldn't follow it. He wasn't criticizing them for following the law. So this is a common objection that comes, and we can see that it's quite clear in this verse. Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you. He's telling his disciples, whatever they tell you to do from the law, follow the law. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. So don't be like them. They preach and they don't practice. Follow what they're telling you. So again, a constant message throughout the life of Jesus. What about the disciples after Jesus? In the book of Acts, the chapter 2, we see the disciples are going to the temple, preaching and gaining followers. This can only be the case if they were observing the Jewish law. The Jews wouldn't allow them. Wouldn't allow them there if they were not following the law. In Acts, again, Acts is about the disciples. We see a man named Ananias. He was a devout observer of the law. Clearly it states there. And if you look at the book of James, which was apparently written by the half-brother of Jesus, look at what he's saying. According to Christians, this is written by a disciple. If you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbor as you love yourself, you are doing right. But if you show favoritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as lawbreakers. For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. So he's clearly, again, James, the disciple or half-brother of Jesus, is clearly again saying the law has to be followed. The law of God needs to be followed. This was the message of Jesus. This was the message of the disciples after Jesus. Now, a certain problem occurred when Christianity spread to the Gentiles. Gentiles means non-Jews. So what are we going to do? What's going to happen? And Paul was the one who was taking Christianity to the Gentiles. So the book of Acts discusses this whole issue. So it says that certain people came to these Gentiles and told them, until you get circumcised, you can't be saved. And Paul said, no, you don't, because Paul was saying you don't have to follow the law in the first place. So a dispute occurred between the Christians. Some were saying that you Christians need to be circumcised. Paul was saying, no, they don't. So Paul and Barnabas now went to Jerusalem to see the apostles to ask them, when we take Christianity to the Gentiles, which is like, still a branch of Judaism, do they have to follow the law or not? So James was in charge. He was the leader of the disciples in Jerusalem. He says that it is my judgment, therefore, we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles. We should write to them telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual morality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood. And so basically what James does is he says, okay, these Gentiles are new to Christianity. They're not Jews. They're going to be hard to follow the whole law, but they still need to start slowly. So he gives them like some essential commandments and says, follow these. And Paul, what does Paul do? Paul hears the disciples telling him that you have to do this. But in his writings, Paul says, no, you don't have to listen to any of this. And we'll see it here. So the book of Acts is clearly telling us that the disciples made a decision. They had a council. They made a decision. They said, even the Gentiles who come to Christianity need to watch what food they eat. They need to stay away from sexual immorality, and etc., etc. When we look at Paul, this is Paul's writings. And I'm just going to read it out again so we get an understanding of how Paul is thinking. He says, now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped and all the world may become guilty before God. So for Paul, the whole point of the law was that so you can't follow it, so you become guilty. That's how he understands the law of God, is to show you that you're very weak and you can't follow it. So there's no point to it except to make you guilty. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. So he says, you keeping all the commandments of God cannot make you justified. The law is just there to show you that you are sinful. Basically, he's saying the law is too difficult for you to keep. Now look at the Old Testament, the Deuteronomy. God is speaking here in the Old Testament. He says, now what I am commanding you today is not too difficult. It's not beyond your reach. It's not up in heavens that you will ask who will ascend to heaven. When God is giving his commandments, he's literally saying, these commandments are not too difficult. You can keep them. Everyone can manage them. But what is Paul saying? Paul saying it's too difficult. No one can do it. Therefore, you don't have to keep the commandments. So all of these quotes are quite important here. Paul, when it comes to eating meat, we saw the disciples said, you know what, you need to watch. Even the new Christians, the Gentiles, need to watch which meat they eat. Paul says, but food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse if we do not eat and no better if we do. And he goes in detail, showing you can even if the food was sacrificed to idols, there's no problem in you eating it. No issue. Completely against what the disciples were saying. And look at now, I'll just show other quotes from the book of Revelation. It shows, he's talking about a specific situation. She misleads my servants into eating of food sacrificed to idols. So even in the book of Revelation, it's considered a sin. Paul saying it's not a sin. In these other two quotes which come from church fathers, it says clearly, keep strictly away from meat sacrificed to idols. Paul says you can eat it. Justin Martyr, all Christians look up to Justin Martyr. He's like one of their salaf, if you could say that. He says, I would rather abide by every torture, even death, than worship idols or eat meat offered to idols. But Paul says you can eat meat offered to idols. So you can see here again how it's completely different. And now an important quote here to show Christians how Paul misquotes the Old Testament. So he quotes and he says, what does it say, the Old Testament? It says the word is near you, it's in your mouth, it's in your heart. That is the message concerning faith. So he's trying to show that you just need to say it, you just need to believe it, and you're saved. So he's saying that the Old Testament says the word is in your mouth and it's in your heart. But look at what the Old Testament actually says. The word is very near you, it's in your mouth and in your heart, so you may obey it. So when he quoted the Old Testament, he left that part out, so you may obey it, because he doesn't want you to follow the commandments. So he just chopped the verse in half, quoted that, and said, see, it's saying you just need to believe and you just need to talk. Whereas there's another part to the verse, so you may obey it, meaning you need to follow the law. So clear misquote from Paul. Is it just a logical perspective? Is that one of our main arguments against atheists is that we need the law of God to help us to morality, to tell us what's right, what's wrong. And so, yes, certain things maybe we can understand, but many things we can't understand. That's one of our major arguments against atheists. And if you as a Christian are going to come and say the law is gone, the law of God doesn't matter, you just need to believe with your heart and love God, then how are you any different from an atheist when it comes to morality, deciding what's right, deciding what's wrong? And again, as you said, it's a great insult to God to believe that his law was just there to show you that you are sinful. So just from a logical perspective also, we need to tackle that. So inshallah, that's the third topic of discourse. It's very simple, nothing much to understand there, just many quotes showing us doing very similar things to the old prophets, and also showing that the law is not abrogated according to Jesus, according to his disciples, and according to many Christians coming thereafter. So Jazakallah khairan, that will end today's topics, and next week we will discuss the Trinity, and we will discuss Muhammad in the Bible, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, inshaAllah.
الشهيد اللطيف الخبير